And Frank Isola brought this up on Around the Horn yesterday, that basically he believes that it's going to happen when the play resumes in the NBA, whether it's the tail end of the regular season or if they just jump straight to the NBA's postseason, that Kevin Durant, in some way, shape, or form, will play for the Brooklyn Nets. And that obviously has got a lot of speculation because we're just about a year out now, maybe a little less than a year.
A little less than a year. Heard it in June last year.
A little less than a year when Kevin Durant tore that Achilles in the finals against the Toronto Raptors. And as the schedule would have it, right now that series would be between the Raptors if the playoffs would go on the basic seeding right now in the East. The first series would be the Raptors against the Nets, who are at 30 and 34. What, a game and a half out of 8th spot and in the 7th spot.
Actually a half game. It's a half game between them and Orlando. So it would depend on if there was any more regular season games. It's basically between those two teams for 7 and 8. So they'd play either Toronto or Milwaukee if they were to come.
Yeah, and Nets GM Sean Marks left the door open slightly for Kevin Durant. He was speaking to News Hub in his native New Zealand about the idea of Kevin Durant returning, basically saying that's a $100 million question, $110 million question. In all seriousness, we've tried not to talk about his timeline a lot, but a lot of people are talking about the potential of Kevin Durant coming back, including his manager, Rich Kleiman, who was on the Michael Kay show earlier, basically saying the possibility of Kevin Durant. Remember, he had talked about coming back for the Olympics.
Right, which would be in July.
Which would have been in July, and we might be playing some sort of basketball potentially here in this country in July. And he was on the Michael Kay show on 98.7 ESPN New York and asked about the idea of Durant maybe being back for the NBA's postseason.
Could he play? When this stopped, like when all this stopped, that kind of conversation didn't continue because there was just no reason to have that conversation. It just wasn't even on a list of priorities. And for Kevin and I, it doesn't feel like it makes any sense to have that conversation because it all seems so unrealistic. I figure that if it wasn't unrealistic, that the conversation would be brought up. So, my assumption is no, and I've kept saying that just because I haven't really had the conversation, and I don't think anything's changed.
Okay, so he's not having the conversation, but a lot of other people are having that conversation, including Jay Williams, who does a great job for us. He was on the jump. And while Frank Isola said he thinks it will happen, count Jay on the counter camp.
Every time I talk to Kev, he's saying he's been in the gym and that he feels really good. And I think that's incredible. I also think you have to factor in this pandemic and rehab time and how all that plays into it. And so much of this, Rachel, is a moving target. To be realistic, say if hypothetically we don't have games that end the regular season and you go right back into the playoffs, the amount of games that you have to play in such a short time frame, almost you could say it can be used against Kevin to get hurt if he's not managed the proper way. That's way different than you starting out next regular season and kind of easing back into the flow and the rhythm of what your playing time will be and the time you spend doing rehab. So, look, Kevin is his own man. I just don't know if I see it being as realistic, him coming back and playing in the playoffs if we do have playoffs, especially if Kyrie's not playing as well.
Oh, I think that's the big thing there, in all honesty. Remember, Kyrie had shoulder surgery at the beginning of March, and it was supposed to be a 6-month situation. So you're talking September. Now, we don't know when basketball is coming back. Would it be after September to run the playoff to where Kyrie could come back? The thing for KD, if he was expecting to play in the Olympics in July, but remember, that would have been off normal rehab procedures because this is normally a year injury, and we're not even at a year yet, and his normal rehab routine has been interrupted. At some point in March, that was interrupted as far as where he was rehabbing, how he was rehabbing, because facilities have been closed. He's not going to anywhere to run and or train on gyms because they're closed. So that part of it has been thrown off a little bit. So I think there are a few wrenches, that get thrown into this before we could see it happen.
It makes it unrealistic, ultimately, I guess, just the gamble for me. And it'd be interesting, Kevin Durant, because we know the way he thinks about all this stuff is a little different. Kevin Durant is someone who wants to make sure, I think this time around, that he's getting the credit for what goes on here, right? He was the driving part of what happened here. It wasn't, we'll go after Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. It was, we'll get Kevin Durant, and if he's okay with Kyrie Irving being a part of this, then we'll get him too. And so I just don't know if there's enough of that on the table right now in what's going to be, however it shapes out, a very strange postseason format for the NBA.
So then that's the other part of it, right? Would he be with Kyrie? Or do you think in this shortened thing you have the opportunity, if Kevin Durant comes back, to maybe win something you had no business winning,
But not without Kyrie. I wouldn't do it without Kyrie.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm trying to figure out, is it possible to separate those two things? Because you brought it up earlier, Mike, in the 98 NBA season when there was a shortened season, the Knicks, who were an 8 seed going into the playoffs, actually made it to the NBA Finals. They lost to the Spurs, the first of
But they made it there as an 8 seed.
But they got there. And if you believe, whether it's with or without Kyrie, that if you add Kevin Durant to that team, because they played most of this season without Kyrie to begin with.
Played 20 games, and they're so without Kyrie 20 games, without Kevin, they're the 7th seed. There's no way I would think about, because you're talking about stealing one here, right?
That's exactly
kind of coming
right.
in at the end. I don't think they're doing it without both of them. I really don't, and I think it would be too much of a question mark to try and roll the dice when you haven't even started with these two yet.
This isn't a slight, because I think the rest of their roster was better in a lot of ways. The Raptors last year are an interesting case study in this and how far one player can take a team, because the Raptors had been a perennial team that was a top 2 seed in the Eastern Conference, certainly had some moves in there. DeMar DeRozan going to San Antonio is a part of all of this, but bringing in Kawhi Leonard was the difference of them getting over the hump. Now, for Brooklyn, a team that has been in the last couple years, made the playoffs last year, has been on a trajectory that made them appealing to these guys.
Right.
Would Kevin Durant alone be enough? But this is the part that gets interesting to me is he enough in the given environment? Like, how much? Because he hasn't played it all this season. If Kevin Durant, Dad, was healthy enough to be cleared, and you're saying he could come back, and we hear, this multi-week process for these guys to ramp back up and be ready to play basketball, is what he could get into, any sort of rhythm there with his teammates, worth enough against what other teams have had for the course of the whole season? Like, at this point, with how much time there's been off, how much cohesive credit are we giving the other teams in the league who are playing an entire year almost leading up to this?
To me, no. To me, it wouldn't be worth it.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming, sports, and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.